Hello, and welcome back to the Fabric of Industry Podcast, Episode 12, International Organizations Part 2. I am your host, Adam Grange. I want to apologize for the couple-month break. I've been busy with school and some other life stuff, but we're back on track now. So we'll do this episode to finish off our International Organizations series, just a two-part series, and then I'm planning on moving into the secondary sector next episode. In this episode, this second part, it may or may not lead to a third part. I don't think it will. I think we'll be able to cover everything here just fine. We will hopefully be covering many of the world's most prominent IGOs, and that stands for intergovernmental organizations. Sorry. This includes the World Bank, the IMF, the WTO, UNESCO, OPEC, several other military and trade and regional alliances as well. There are many smaller ones that you may have heard of, like CERN, that I won't be touching on, but may bring up in future episodes. But the logistics of how they work aren't necessarily super important, and you should get a good idea of how most international organizations operate on a foundational level from the last episode on the United Nations and this episode as well. I think the United Nations was a good starting place because it is the largest and quite broad and mostly unspecific, and understanding where a lot of global decisions come from is important in beginning to understand why some things we'll talk about later are the way that they are. All of the IGOs in this episode are more specific. Some of them super specific, and most of them are regional, with exceptions like the World Bank. And they're important to understand on a more micro scale as compared to the whole globe of decision making and its impact as with the United Nations. So we'll generally follow the flow from last episode, though it and no other episode are recommended as pre-listening. The World Bank is what we'll start with. It's quite a large IGO, and it can be summed up as a big loan machine. Okay, moving on to the IMF. That was a joke. We're still going to talk about the World Bank for a while. It is also known as WBG, but I will just be saying the World Bank. The WBG stands for World Bank Group, but it's mostly referred to as World Bank, I think, in most of the news articles and the literature. I know I just said that these IGOs are more specific and less broad than the United Nations, but the World Bank is a bit of an exception because 189 internationally recognized countries are members. Membership, however, works a bit different than in the United Nations, as each country is known as a shareholder, and the amount of shares, or voting power, granted to a country is roughly based on the size of the economy, since that usually denotes which country contributes more funds, with the US being the largest, followed by Japan, China, and Germany. This, of course, is an immediate criticism of the World Bank, with larger economic powers holding more voting rights than smaller countries. Although the voting then works fairly similar to the UN General Assembly, in that there is a board of governors who are the chief group of decision makers, and each country appoints only one governor. The World Bank is also about as old as the United Nations, being formed in 1944 to help rebuild Europe and Japan after World War II. This is where the structure begins, which is how we will divide a lot of our time talking about the World Bank. Although the overall goals today are to reduce global poverty and to promote shared prosperity among all. Those are rather broad goals, but we'll get into that a little bit later. So it didn't begin as the World Bank, but as the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which has now become one of the 5 institutions of the World Bank. The other 4 are the International Development Association, or IDA, the International Finance Corporation, or IFC, the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, or MIGA, and the International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes, or ICSID. As to not confuse us further on, since I said I will be saying the World Bank to refer to the whole IGO. Technically, as I said earlier, the whole IGO is known as the World Bank Group, which is the group of these 5 institutions, and that is why I said it is known as WBG. The World Bank is technically known as just the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, or IBRD, which is what it was initially known as, and the International Development Association, or IDA, since that is the lending and monetary sections. Those are the lending and monetary sections. So just be aware that when I say the World Bank, I really mean the World Bank group as a whole, but also it's more focused on those two branches that are focused on the lending and monetary aspects. So anyways, we'll start with that'll all become clear as I move through all of the institutions. So we'll start with the IBRD, since this is where the World Bank started, and probably performs the function most people would attribute to the World Bank. The IBRD, according to worldbank.org, this is a quote, provides policy advice and loans to low and middle income countries. It's a bit of a broad definition, so let's break it down. The loans part there ostensibly means the IBRD is the lending branch of the World Bank. But notably, it does not give loans to high income countries, though this is because the World Bank is primarily a development bank. These loans are designed to give middle and low income countries, mostly low income countries, long term economic growth and poverty reduction. Since these are loans, they are required to be paid back with interest, albeit low interest. Since the loans are required to be repaid, however, they are only given to countries that can repay the loans, so the market conditions are analyzed before loans are given out, the local market conditions. These are key distinctions from the IDA, which we'll get to next. This is the true development bank branch of the World Bank, because while it focuses on developing countries, it expects the loans to be repaid once a certain development and economic goals are reached. This can and has been shown to actually foster development over just giving poorer countries money. Overall, the IBRD has given out over $500 billion US dollars in loans since its inception in 1944. However, that is not without its place, since that is what the IDA does, just giving out money. The IDA, once again, according to the worldbank.org website, provides grants and low-interest loans to low-income countries. The IDA is specifically designed to help only the world's poorest countries who are not deemed able to be able to pay back loans or essentially be credit worthy. This is like if you apply to buy a house, but your country's credit monitoring system says you are not trustworthy because of past inability to pay loans back. But then the government has a grant program to help purchase a house since you are very poor. Of course, on a much larger scale of grants to entire countries. Unlike the IBRD, the IDA relies almost entirely on donations, with some money coming in from a fund created from past IDA loan repayments. There have also been some rare cases of funds transferring from the IBRD when the IBRD is in profit. It usually is not in profit. Both of these branches help to develop a lot of the same things like education, healthcare, clean water and sanitation, agricultural development and food security, infrastructure projects like roads and power grids, and even governance and institutional capacity. Just the general development things that you would expect money to be supporting in a less developed country. In the case of the IDA specifically, most of the grants and loans are targeted to provide basic levels and foundations of development projects, while the IBRD targets abandoned projects or upgrades. The repayment periods for IDA loans are also typically much longer than IBRD loans. And, of course, the grants are not required to be paid back at all, though the grants are rarer and really only go to countries that are deemed completely unable to pay a loan back. And, of course, again, those pretty much only come from donations. So do the loans, but that's partially why the grants are much rarer. So, how then is this creditworthiness from either branch decided on? Well, income level is the first major thing looked at, since a higher income per capita relates heavily to an ability to be able to pay a loan back. Total public debt levels, the debt to GDP ratio, and the ratio of debt services to exports and government revenue are all looked at as well. Macroeconomic factors are looked at too, such as inflation rates and stability of exchange rates to the US dollar. And it even goes further to assess government and institutional quality, looking for corruption levels, the effectiveness of institutions that already exist in the country, and how functional the rule of law is. And of course, if there is a track record of repayment with the World Bank or another loan institution like the IMF, well, a good track record certainly helps. But essentially, debt levels and income are income per capita are the two major factors. Because of course, if you have a government that's heavily in debt, that's going to signal a red flag that well they're not going to be as trustworthy to be able to pay a loan back. And the income per capita is also looked at because the people are the ones that are spending the money in the economy to keep the wheels of the economy going. And if the income is particularly low, then there's not a lot of money going into the economy, and that's probably affecting the debt levels of the country as well. It gets very complicated, and if you want more information on how some macroeconomic processes and economic processes work, then I have several episodes going over that. But for this episode, we'll focus on just explaining the IGOs. So we'll move on to the third branch, the third institution, that is known as the International Finance Corporation, or IFC. The website, again, we'll go to the website for the definition. It describes the IFC as encouraging private sector growth through lending and mobilizing other investors. The major difference here from the other two branches is the focus on private companies and not governments themselves. This goal is to promote economic growth, especially in a specific sector, and then job creation and economic stability. This is done through loans, of course, but also equity investments and guarantees. These are not necessarily important to understand the specifics of, just know that they are alternate paths toward private investment. Giving money to private companies, essentially, is what that means. The money is not just thrown to whatever company, though. There are specific areas investment is focused towards. Financial services, obviously things like energy, transportation, telecommunications, manufacturing, industrialized agriculture, healthcare, education. Again, the types of things that you would want to develop in an underdeveloped country, companies that focus on building and developing into those types of things are going to be companies that are a lot more focused on to get loans from the IFC. There are also criteria, since the risk of investing in a private company can be higher than a government. Usually it's less money, but at least a government, most governments in the world at least have some kind of track record of not stealing the money, I suppose. There are strict analyses and reports generated to evaluate the viability of a business, the projected impact that it may have on development, and of course if it is going to be sustainable financially. So we will get into the knowledge portion of the World Bank a bit later and go over some of those things in a bit more detail. The next institution, the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, or MIGA, offers political risk insurance known as guarantees to encourage private investment in developing countries. That's another quote from the World Bank website. So instead of directly investing in private sector industries like the IFC, MIGA uses its funds to provide insurance to private investors themselves. It gives this insurance to ventures and projects that can help with development, along the same criteria that the IFC uses. The insurance itself covers expropriation, which is the government seizing assets. So let's say you set up shop as a private company trying to develop in an underdeveloped country, and the government decides it wants to seize your assets. Well, the expropriation insurance covers against that. It also covers a breach of contract by a government, currency inconvertibility, fund transfer restrictions, and against war and civil disturbance. And those are all things that are, of course, more common in less developed countries than more developed countries. So most major things that could happen in a country that might discourage a private investor in moving or creating a business there are covered. However, these guarantees are offered to potential investments in high-risk states. So while this branch is a good complement to the IFC, it's very specific because the IFC will still work in lower risk states, middle developing countries, so think like South American countries or even some Asian countries, but the least developed parts of the world, sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, those parts of the world, Afghanistan, that's where you're going to be able to get insurance coverage essentially from MIGA if you are a private company. The final of the 5 institutions is the International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes, or ICSID, which perhaps sounds self-explanatory. According to the worldbank.org website, again, the branch helps private investors and foreign countries resolve disputes when differences arise. So, a broad definition, but it is important to note that ICSID is a forum, and so it has no policing power, I've mentioned this several other times, or ability to seize assets itself. It is entirely reliant on state cooperation, although in somewhat of a unique way. An ICSID arbitral award, is a binding judgment that acts as a final judgment if it were decided on in a national court itself, like a court in a country itself. This means that national courts cannot relitigate the case, and they must enforce the award if they are a member of ICSID. Then, domestic law is used for enforcement, like through policing power or seizure of assets. However, you notice that I said that member of ICSID. That's an important point there because not all members of the World Bank itself are members of ICSID. So, somewhat similar to the ICC, the International Criminal Court we discussed in the last episode, the ICSID is fairly similar to that. Only 158 of the 189 members of the World Bank are members of ICSID, so a good portion of them. But some major ones that are not members include countries like Brazil and India. There are a lot of caveats to how enforcement of members works specifically, but I think that's good enough for a general idea, which I think is all we need. So now on to my favorite part of the World Bank. The World Bank is also what they like to refer to themselves as a knowledge bank. So they're a development bank and a knowledge bank. I have used World Bank resources a lot already, and will continue to do so. The resources are good. Much like the UNDP from last episode and their Human Development Report, the World Bank publishes the World Development Report annually. Though the HDR and the WDR share a lot of similarities, the focus of the HDR is human development and well-being, while the focus of the WDR is economic and general development policy. So not just specifically focusing on human development. A lot of the WDR is published to guide economic development and progress through policy, and it's a very technical read, while the HDR is more easily accessible. The WDR guides a lot of decision-making on giving out loans as well, not just guiding the World Bank, but other organizations like the IMF that give out loans. The WDR will guide some of that decision-making. Remember, though, as we're finishing the World Bank here, the United Nations and the World Bank are related organizations, so they're not entirely separate. And as I just mentioned, the IMF, we'll keep on the topic of development banks, but move on from the World Bank. Let's talk about the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF. So just as with the World Bank, I have used a lot of IMF resources and will continue to do so, since it is also a good knowledge bank. The IMF was also created at the same Bretton Woods conference in 1944 that created the World Bank, but the IMF today is a specialized agency of the United Nations, while the World Bank is a related organization, like I just said. Both types are autonomous organizations separate from the UN, but if you remember from last episode, related organizations have less stringent rules on how they act in accordance with the UN, so the World Bank has a little more leeway in some of the stuff they do in accordance with the UN. It's easier to think maybe of specialized agencies as essentially a part of the UN, while related organizations just work with the UN. I'm not Actually, now that I think about it, I'm not sure if I mentioned the specific differences last episode, so I apologize if I didn't, but I believe I did. Anyway, both of the World Bank and the IMF are development banks, as I said, as well as knowledge banks. But the World Bank is more focused on per country economies, while the IMF is more focused on the international monetary system and global currency stability. So exchange rates, especially. The IMF is the last resort for crisis lending, like the absolute last resort in terms of large IGOs, while the World Bank focuses on development investing, so more proactive, you might say. According to IMF.org, this is a quote, the IMF has three critical missions: furthering international monetary cooperation, encouraging the expansion of trade and economic growth, and discouraging policies that would harm prosperity. The IMF elects to achieve these goals primarily through lending, but offers policy advice by surveying economic policy of poorer countries as well. It also engages in what is called capacity development, which is focused on institutional development, particularly with interest in banking, finance sectors, and statistical agencies. So there's your knowledge again. The money required for all of this comes from a quota pool member countries of the IMF can contribute to, and qualified countries can borrow from for dealing with balance of payment problems in their own country. This quota is based on a few factors, but mainly is based on the economic size of the country, so similar to the World Bank's voting status. Qualification for borrowing is, of course, first determined from the level of need for a balance of payment problem, which can be that can be like a shortage of foreign currency, usually, of course, US dollars, or pressure on the country's own currency exchange rate. And reasons that may occur are in the thousands, so we won't go over those. Qualification for a loan also usually requires approval of an IMF program, which are generally major sources of controversy. This is because IMF programs take the policy advice the IMF gives out and puts it to action. So these policies range from things like fiscal reforms, usually regarding deficit reduction and public debt stabilization, to monetary reform, which usually aims to control inflation and stabilize the national currency. Of course, qualification is also dependent on being a member of the IMF itself. And the IMF has 191 member countries, while remember the World Bank has 189. I don't remember which two are missing. I think every World Bank member is an IMF member as well. So I think there's only two countries missing. I didn't write them down, but it's not that important, the specific countries. But this circles back to the quota, in that the relative power a member has in the IMF is based on their personal quota, which in turn gives them voting power within the IMF. So that will lead me to talking about criticisms, since I'm sure you're wondering, well, he just brought up that there's criticisms but didn't go into them. So I'll go over the criticisms of both the World Bank and the IMF. They're somewhat similar, but I'll start with the IMF. Because of the quota system, as I mentioned, the poorest countries in the world are vastly underrepresented in terms of power within the IMF, while the richest countries hold a majority of the power. So they get to essentially decide how the IMF programs are implemented into the poorer countries. So this is primarily an issue of political power imbalance, since the IMF is widely considered a bureaucracy, which is another criticism since it is so vast. The decision making is considered inefficient and, of course, biased. This is also a criticism of the World Bank, as even though the structure is different from the IMF, the World Bank still functions as a bureaucracy would. There are also many environmental and human rights controversies, very specific ones, but as these do not criticize the structure and intended function of the World Bank and IMF directly, I won't go into detail here. We do need to move on to the WTO at some point, after all, which we will do now. WTO stands for World Trade Organization. I know I've brought them up before, so sort of moving down in relative power from the other major organizations I've talked about. The WTO has 166 member countries. I suppose I should mention now that this number can, of course, change, either increasing or decreasing, but that does not matter for all IGOs. Think about regional trade organizations like NAFTA that we'll talk about later, as it wouldn't be in NAFTA's interest to expand to include more member countries. Anyway, focusing on the WTO. This is an especially important organization for much of what we talk about directly, because it essentially regulates and facilitates global trade. The 166 members comprise almost 98% of current global trade. The main goals of the WTO, so that means, before that other, the last 2% of countries that aren't members, the other members out of the 166 that are globally recognized countries that comprise the other 2% of global trade, that's a bit more specific. Once those, once those countries expand their trade and become more developed, they will be more likely to be included as a WTO member. The main goals of the WTO are to promote free and fair trade, to reduce trade barriers like tariffs, and to provide a forum to negotiate trade agreements and solve trade disputes. If you want some more information on trade, again, I spoke about that in, I want to say episode 7, Economic Growth. Sorry if that's wrong. If one of the most powerful countries in the world decides to ban a sector of trade from another, the WTO provides the means to solve that issue. The decisions that come out of the forum are legally binding on member states and can deal with trade in goods, trade in services, or even intellectual property. It also aims to have domestic markets treat foreign trade items as the same as domestic ones once those foreign trade items are inside of the domestic market. It has been praised in the past for aiding in the removal of harmful tariffs and facilitating transparency between global trade markets. As I've read in economic studies from the American Economic Review and the Journal of Political Economy, the WTO also aims to provide specialized treatment of developing countries to get their trade goods into the global markets. However, this is part of the criticism the organization faces, because there are also studies providing evidence to suggest developing countries are still left out more and are sometimes even harmed by WTO policies. And the free trade that the WTO facilitates benefits richer countries more. Along with the World Bank and the IMF, these three are generally considered the world's largest economic IGOs. The United Nations is generally not considered an economic IGO. So the World Bank, the IMF, and the WTO are the world's largest economic IGOs. And since we are still on the topic of economic IGOs, let's discuss OPEC next. So as you can see, I'm kind of moving through these at a much quicker pace since we're not going over the entire United Nations, and a lot of these are, again, more specific. So OPEC stands for the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries. This IGO gets quite a bit smaller in terms of member countries with only 13, but I'm sure we've all heard about OPEC in the news or something like that before. The OPEC does not include all of the world's petroleum exporting countries. So I'll quickly list the 13 so you can kind of get an idea of where they're located. Algeria, Congo, Equatorial Guinea, Gabon, Libya, and Nigeria are the African countries. Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE are the Middle Eastern countries, and Venezuela is the only country in South America. Part of the reason Venezuela is part of OPEC is because they have the largest known oil reserves in the world. Because other than that, the other 12 countries are in a relatively more connected part of the globe. The point of OPEC is to help stabilize global oil prices, since each of the member countries hold significant influence due to the natural oil reserves they hold. OPEC themselves estimates about 79% of the world's proven oil reserves are in its member states, with, again, Venezuela holding the largest known reserves in the world, and the Middle Eastern countries accounting for 2/3 of the OPEC reserves, so 2/3 of that 79%. OPEC works by having member countries meet production targets set by OPEC. These vary between member countries. This helps to ensure efficient and economic delivery of petroleum to consumers while attempting to avoid major price fluctuations. This, of course, means that OPEC is criticized for manipulation of oil prices to help benefit only member countries and to harm countries who mostly import oil. I think about like China. Again, if you've heard anything in the news about China struggling getting oil or something like that, this is the criticism where those stories essentially come from. OPEC is pretty important for us, as petroleum would be a part of many episodes to come. Now we'll get into several other major trade organizations. The main goals of most trade organizations are to regulate or eliminate tariffs, protect domestic markets from foreign ones, increase investment, local investment, protect intellectual property rights, promote fair competition within the member countries, and facilitate cross-border trade among the countries that are members of their specific trade organization. NAFTA is, as I mentioned earlier, is perhaps the most well-known, although technically the EU is a trade organization too, but it's a bit more complex, so we'll get into that later. NAFTA stands for North American Free Trade Agreement, and it includes only Canada, the United States, and Mexico. The purpose is, as they are the only three countries in North America, the purpose is free trade among these countries. Sorry, I lost my train of thought for a second. Since even though it is only three countries, they are all large in terms of GDP and land area. Mercosur is the major one in South America, and it includes Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay, and there are several other hopeful or attending member states. Venezuela is also currently suspended, but that may change. We're not sure. There are also many, like the EU, that are more multilateral in being regional organizations that also focus on economic empowerment of the member states and not just facilitating trade. The general goals of these are to promote free trade, especially with specific free trade zones, but also to foster political cooperation, support development, and facilitate the movement of citizens between member states. So if you think about NAFTA for a second, any citizen of the United States still needs a passport to visit Canada, to cross the border to Canada or to Mexico, as well as Mexico going into the United States or Canada. However, with the EU, And some of these other ones, they, like I said, like to try and facilitate movement of citizens between the member states by eliminating the need for passports. So if you go from Germany to France or to Austria, you don't need a passport. So I'll save the EU for last since it's perhaps the most well known. So we'll start with ASEAN. I guess you could say ASEAN or something. That stands for the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. This includes 10 countries, those being Brunei, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam. So most of the countries that you would expect to be in Southeast Asia. ASEAN oversees the ASEAN Free Trade Area, or AFTA, and the ASEAN Economic Community, or AEC, which the goal is to create a single market and production base for the member states. SAARC is the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation and includes 8 members, those being Bangladesh, India, Nepal, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, the Maldives, and Pakistan, as well as Afghanistan, although I believe Afghanistan is currently not an active member. SAARC has attempted to mirror NAFTA and the tariff reduction with SAFTA, the South Asian Free Trade Agreement, though with considerably weaker implementation. The GCC is the Gulf Cooperation Council, and since there are so many Gulfs in the world, this is specifically for the Arab states in the Persian Gulf. This includes Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE for a total of 6 members. There are several of these organizations in Africa, one for the East, one for the West, one for Central Africa, and then one for the South. IGAD, is the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, and you wouldn't know it is a regional organization for East Africa from the name. Its member states are Djibouti, Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, South Sudan, Uganda, and Eritrea. Its original function was primarily for drought prevention and resilience, but has since expanded to be a regional organization for development, peace, and security, and implementing many of the general goals of these regional organizations. The South African Development Community, or SADC, is more aptly named. Its member states are too many to list, but some of the prominent members are South Africa, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the DRC, and Botswana. The SADC Free Trade Area is not a full customs union, but as other free trade areas are, but it does aim to reduce tariffs for its members. CEMAC, SCEMAC, is the Economic and Monetary Community of Central Africa, though the actual acronym is French. This includes 6 countries, which are Cameroon, Chad, Equatorial Guinea, Gabon, the Republic of the Congo, and the Central African Republic. This is one regional organization that uses a common currency, actually, which is the Central African franc. The final African one I'll mention here is ECOWAS, which is the Economic Community of West African States. There are also too many to list here, so some prominent members are Ghana and Nigeria. And finally, I will discuss the European Union. The EU is perhaps the most successful regional organization. It is somewhat well known that despite having a bit over 5% of the world's population, the EU produces 1/6 of the global GDP. So there are 27 member states, so I won't list them all, but you can assume the usual Western European countries are members. Some prominent countries that are not members are the United Kingdom, Switzerland, and Norway. The EU is also probably well known for free travel, as I mentioned earlier, where passport controls have been abolished for almost every member state. And again, this means that the borders for countries are still intact, but people can go from country to country without needing a passport. Essentially, the EU paved the way for free movement of people, goods and services, and capital between different countries. Interestingly, the EU represents itself at the UN and the WTO, even though member countries also represent themselves, which becomes a criticism of the UN and the WTO. However, I think the EU is a major reason people view organizations like this as being a government of governments, so to speak. This is known as sui generis, I think that's how you pronounce it, or a class of its own. The intricacies of the EU are, well, they're fascinating. It's broad, very broad. It's very vast. So we'll leave the discussion as a general one, as I have with the other IGOs. There are also continental organizations, which include almost every country in a certain continent. The Organization of American States is all of North, Central, and South America, not including Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, and French Guinea. Venezuela and Cuba for political reasons. Well, I guess all of them for political reasons. I'm not exactly sure, but Venezuela and Cuba mostly because of their opposition to the United States. Nicaragua, I'm not exactly sure why they're not included. And then French Guinea is, of course, French, so it's not included. The Council of Europe is, of course, Europe and French Guinea. The African Union is every single country in continental Africa plus Madagascar. It's gigantic. And you've probably heard of the African Union before. It has attempted to mirror the EU, but again, to not nearly the effect that the EU has in Europe. The Asia Cooperation Dialogue is most of Central, East, and South Asia, plus the Arabian Peninsula. And the Pacific Island Forum is Australia, New Zealand, and then most of Oceania. So most of the island nations over there. In general, these are all largely not very functional. So it's not even just the African Union, it's pretty much all of them. So they're not super important to know the intricacies of how they work. I would, however, like to quickly discuss the Group of Seven before moving on. There are a lot of groups. Group of 6, Group of 7, Group of 9, I think. But the Group of 7 is by far the most prominent. Because the 7 countries are France, Germany, Italy, the United Kingdom, Japan, the United States, and Canada. And also, technically, again, the entire EU is a member, but it's not numbered. These are all extremely powerful countries, and the goal of G7, which is how it's denoted, is mainly on liberal democracy and representative government. So a bit of an interesting one there that it focuses mostly on a certain type of government. Promoting it through within its member states and the EU and even outside of it, but mostly within. Anyway, let's do the only military organization I'm going to talk about because, frankly, it is the only one effective enough to matter. As you may have guessed, that is NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. NATO is comprised of North American and European countries, 32 of them currently. NATO is headquartered in Brussels, Belgium, and consists of most of the major EU countries, Scandinavia, and then, of course, the United States and Canada. It was formed in 1949 to help counter security threats to member states, mostly from the Soviet Union at the time. Today, it is the world's largest military alliance by far, and it is also considered a political one because it is actually quite a large IGO. NATO works as a collective defense, which means an attack on one member state is an attack on all member states. That is the treaty between the member states. This is a pretty famous line in Article 5 of the treaty, and it has only been invoked once, and that is after the September 11th attacks against the United States in 2001. It also works as a military coordination effort with training and planning between member states' militaries. There are also many partner countries that NATO aids with security concerns outside of the member states. NATO also works a lot with cybersecurity, space monitoring, and disaster response, though there are arguably more effective organizations for the latter. But I thought that was an interesting thing that most people probably don't attribute to NATO, uh, at least with the cybersecurity. NATO also standardizes arms within member states. So, for example, the very common round used in many small arms in NATO countries is the 5.56 by 45 millimeter, or 5.56 as it's commonly called, at least in the United States. This is used in weapons like the M16 or the AR-15 platform and the FN SCAR L. 7.62 by 5.1 millimeter is also standardized and is distinctly different from the 7.62 by 3.9 millimeter that the famous AK-47 is chambered in, but they are both colloquially referred to as 7.62, although most of the time the NATO round is referred to as 7.62 by 5.1. The other famous round, aside from 5.56, is the 9 by 1.9 millimeter parabellum, or 9 millimeter. This is used very widely by police forces, pilots, and people who carry sidearms, those being guns like the Glock 17, the Beretta M9, which is a famous police gun, and even submachine guns like the H&K MP5. And we'll get much more into all of that when I eventually get around to military industries, which should be quite fun. And with that, we will move on to UNESCO, which is the final organization we will discuss. And it is the final of the UN-related organizations and specialized agencies, which the latter is what UNESCO is, a specialized agency. UNESCO stands for the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. The reason I separated this out of the others is somewhat arbitrary, but it is a rather large specialized agency and also focuses on peace through developing institutions, which institutions are rather important for us. Again, I've discussed that in the previous episode. Since the three sort of sections of UNESCO are education, science, and culture, we will tackle them in that order. Aside from just promoting equal access to education, UNESCO uses some of its funds to directly support teacher training and policies on education, teacher training being a very important one there. This is part of the reason UNESCO also focuses on science and culture as to better implement their work for all three. For example, there cannot be just a basic curriculum for teachers everywhere. This is why the teacher training is so important. UNESCO attempts to take the cultural differences into account when training and designing policies and curriculum, or at least guiding on curriculum. This is, of course, a source of controversy for UNESCO, though. In regards to the work in education, UNESCO leads a program known as Education for Sustainable Development, or ESD. ESD focuses on educating how to develop a sustainable future through the pillars of environmental, economic, and social sustainability. UNESCO, for the science portion, promotes cooperation among the world's scientific community and facilitates discussion between larger scientific IGOs such as CERN, like I mentioned way at the beginning. For the culture part, you may have heard of the World Heritage List, which is managed by UNESCO. That might be their most famous thing that they've done, I would take a guess at. This is a list that includes cultural and natural sites, like the Great Wall of China or Machu Picchu, that are deemed to be of universal value and are therefore subsequently protected by UNESCO. Universal value meaning anyone from any country, anywhere in the world, can benefit from these sites existing. This list also includes natural sites, like I said, like national parks or especially the coral reefs. And I might UNESCO heritage sites might be mentioned in the future, as for example, as I'm thinking here, parts of the Amazon rainforest are protected, but still contain vast amounts of valuable natural resources, which can be a topic of discussion for us. Anyway, in addition, UNESCO works to protect cultural heritage itself, and that's like language and traditions, cultural tradition, intangible things. So not just physical sites. Of course, UNESCO has no way to directly protect or promote these things. It is, like other forums I've mentioned, entirely reliant on the cooperation of member countries and their adherence to the ratifications of the policy that UNESCO puts forth as a forum. This is, of course, a major criticism of UNESCO, but as I've stated before with other IGOs that are forums, it is not truly honest to criticize UNESCO for itself for this because it does operate as a forum. So I think that's probably where I'd like to end this episode. I think it's running pretty long, and that's a good amount of general information on IGOs. So we can finally get back to actually focusing on industries themselves and delving deep into those. I do hope you enjoyed this episode, though, as always. And if you'd like to send a comment or suggestion on to the show, you can do so at fabricofindustry@gmail.com. You can also go to our Facebook page by searching for the Fabric of Industry podcast, and you can join our Discord from the Facebook page as well. If you could leave a positive review on the podcast aggregator of your choice, whether that be Spotify or Apple or something else, that would help the show out greatly. And with that, I'll talk to you next time.